Hello again, everyone. So we're back talking about federalism. In the past couple of videos, I've been talking a lot about the constitutional setup and how all of those constitutional details, from the full faith and credit clause to the privileges and immunities clause to the 10th Amendment, help to sort of resolve some of the potential problems that emerge when you've got multiple states trying to interact with the federal government sort of over top due to the supremacy clause. I also wanted to, though, provide a couple of videos talking about the history of federalism in America. And hopefully that's something that will help to illuminate how putting these constitutional rules into action, the way that we inhabited those institutions over time, has actually changed substantially. So up until the 1930s, if we think about the history of this relationship between the states and the federal government, we had a system that many scholars refer to as dual federalism, which essentially means that we've got states and their localities really holding most of the authority over the way that average people are living their lives. So principally, if you were somebody who lived in the city of Baltimore in like 1810 or something, 1820, 1830, it's very likely that the city of Baltimore would have the vast majority of or be able to have the vast majority of authority over how you lived your daily life. So even the state of Maryland itself wouldn't have that much say in terms of setting up how things would go for you on a daily basis. It was really these localities that were the most important in determining, when and where you could, travel around the city, like what kinds of things you could sell and where, all kinds of different aspects related to commerce, related to housing, related to just the basics of living your daily life. And in that system, while localities had the majority of the power over who gets what, this very limited federal government that existed at the time, this fledgling federal government, was expressly and very rigidly kept separate from state governments. And you can imagine why that is, right? Think about the Denovian case. Think about the U.S. case at the founding. When we're dealing with essentially a system that begins with the Articles of Confederation. Think about that period and how different it must be than to ratify a constitution with the supremacy clause in it. States are still this major player in determining who gets what for average people. And so it seems quite clear that the federal government would be conceived of as this separate layer that's sort of on top of all the states. All the states are here. The federal government is very thin at the top, and it's got a few powers, and it's determining certain kinds of rules related to setting up post offices and determining how the United States military should be established. But the states really are the big thing, and they're not really being permeated by federal government intervention. They're kind of like staying in their own realm, and the federal government is staying in its own realm, determining kinds of decisions. So we have these rigid boundaries between big state governments and limited federal governmental authority. So then comes the Great Depression, right? After this 19th century, where we have a lot of hard boundaries between the federal and the state governments, we saw that especially the Great Depression is part of this story of reshaping this relationship. And so, of course, this is not a history class, but if you go back and read your notes about the New Deal and FDR's response to the Great Depression, we see that there was a really intense need at that time for national level policy coordination. So essentially, the FDR administration identified that individual states alone weren't going to be able to sort of save themselves from the economic crisis without doing some kind of coordinated state, national response. So for the first time, we had this really pressing need to engage in national policymaking. And the key here, the thing that is most important, is that if we think about like Keynesian kind of economics, this was something that the FDR administration thought would be a really helpful tool to rescue us from the Depression. Critically, though, the federal government, as we saw expressly written in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, what does Congress have the ability to do if we go back and look at the enumerated powers? They have the ability to engage in deficit spending. They can borrow money, and they can run up a deficit, and then continue the economy functioning, until they're able to close that gap, hopefully by taxation and by gaining revenue, essentially by heating up the economy enough that they'd be able to sort of pay that back. And so deficit spending is really important during a crisis under the assumptions of Keynesian economics. But states, right, they were not really people who had the ability to do a lot of deficit spending. That's not something that was expressly allowed to them in many contexts. But states have the authority to implement those policies, right? They're the ones at that time with like all the infrastructure to actually reach people on the ground. And so you've got mass unemployment, you've got breadlines, you've got people who are living in tent cities because they don't have any permanent housing. And the government says we need to act now. And so the way that we might do this is we might engage in deficit spending at the federal level. We'll get Congress to pass a bunch of spending bills and set up new organizations at the national level. But we're going to have to cooperate with states to get those people who are living in the states to get access to the new resources that we're creating. So we had this need, right, to engage in more of a cooperative sort of federalism. And so the fundamental questions that need to be asked of this period and of any period when we're talking about decisions related to this new reaching in, right, this new sort of mixing of federal and state authority is as follows. First, does the federal government have some kind of compelling reason to try to harmonize the policies of the state? I think that a lot of people would argue that during the Great Depression, this first federalism question was answered in the affirmative, which is to say, well, if we don't have the Tennessee Valley Authority, what's going to happen to the people of Tennessee? We need some kind of harmonization in terms of economic policy, and the federal government can accomplish it. So that's a check, a positive check on that question. Another question that we might ask ourselves is, how might the federal government do this? How could they actually do it, right? Especially, how can they do it in a way that's not unconstitutional, doesn't violate, for example, the 10th Amendment, or that is not coercive, that doesn't essentially exploit states because of this imbalance in the ability to hold the purse strings. And then finally, I think, for our purposes, for the questions of who gets what in a country where we vote for our elected representatives, is who gets blame or credit for these outcomes, right? Say that we engage in some sort of project of federalism where the federal government is cooperating with states to make something happen. Do we blame or reward the federal government for doing that? Do we blame or reward our state-level incumbents? That's a very important political question. So as we're analyzing cases of federalism in other videos, for example, in our textbook, we should sort of be asking some of these questions. Do we have a compelling reason for this to be done? How could we do it in a way that's not coercive? And then ultimately, if we succeed at it, who gets credit, right? Or if we fail at it, who gets the blame? Okay, so certainly you can read in your textbook about the history of federalism and the development of these different kinds of federalism, from the layer cake federalism of the previous era to the sort of marble cake era of after the New Deal administration. I really want to provide you with this little table here, though, that kind of explains to you in the modern context kind of the different ways that federalism can work. And so essentially there's two different sort of sets of federal state interactions in which either the states have very strict and specific guidelines they have to sort of operate under, the federal government gives them, or there are broader kinds of federalism relationships where the states have a lot of leeway, a lot of wiggle room to be able to experiment with their own specific objectives and priorities. And so, for example, we have the difference here between areas where there is no federal funding, so where the federal government has essentially compelled states to do something and has not provided any funding here, or whether this program is funded through federal grants. And so this is, I think this side here, where we've got categorical grants and block grants as these two vehicles, these two tools that the federal government has to influence states. These are really two of the biggest types of federalism relationships that we have in modern federalism. So either we have these categorical grants where the federal government has provided this money that is for very specific purposes, that's designed to do something extremely specific, where it's been provided, and the states don't really have the ability to change those rules much at all. Compare that with block grants, which is perhaps one of the most common types of federal granting in modern times, where states get something for general purposes, like say, oh, this is for roads, right? But they're able to determine how that gets implemented. I think one example of this type of federal grant comes especially in that area that I just mentioned, transportation. So people who have been living in the Baltimore area for a long time will probably remember some of the debate that was had about building new public transportation systems through the city of Baltimore, this thing called the Red Line. And so essentially there was a large amount of federal money that was on the table to create this thing called the Red Line, which would go east-west through the city, a light rail set of stations that would connect basically the east side of the city to the west via a rapid public transit option. And so essentially the city worked really hard over a number of years to try to implement this thing, and they had all the federal money lined up. They had all of the okays. They had somehow managed to get all the neighborhoods along the line to agree to where the stops would be, which, knowing the politics around that, it's an incredibly miraculous thing that they were able to do that in the first place. However, at the very end of the day, there was a counterproposal that's called the Purple Line, essentially, that is down closer to DC for a different mass transit option. And so we saw that the Hogan administration essentially chose the Purple Line over the Red Line at that time when those two proposals were on the table. And so that is, if there's anything in this class that we'll talk about, a great example of who gets what, right? Where the federal grant money had been provided, and essentially it was all ready, where the federal government said, look, we want you to improve mass transit in this area. We're willing to give you money to make it happen. The state kicks in some money too. And then the state government essentially gets to choose where that goes. And so that's an example, right, where there's less strict rules about how this specific money is to be spent. Really, the idea is you just spend it on transportation. Over here, though, we also have this other side where we've got instances where there's just no federal funding. And so we saw, especially in an earlier era of the 20th century, right, after the New Deal, where we had more and more what we call mandates and standards, federal standards. So we saw this everywhere from education policy to transportation, for example, where the federal government essentially said, look, you've got to meet these different standards. We've got these mandates. You must comply. We want to get all the states on board with the exact same kinds of initiatives. We want to homogenize, and we're not going to provide you with money to do that. And so that's a very hard thing for states to do. And we saw that essentially there was this backlash that occurred, essentially a conservative backlash against the sort of size of federal influence in the latter half of the 20th century. And that pushback has resulted in a little bit more relaxed kinds of grant funding in the modern period relative to this previous era. New federalism is especially characterized by experiments. So, if we think about the Affordable Care Act, for example, this, quote unquote, Obamacare is what I'm talking about. We saw that a lot of proposals for national level healthcare reform were experimented with at the state level prior to their implementation at the national level through this massive government or federal government bill, right? And so many of the principles of the Affordable Care Act actually had been tried out in Massachusetts in advance of the Obama administration's willingness to try this system out as a bill in Congress. And it really goes to show, it's kind of an example of the fact that when states are allowed to pursue diverse different policies, and they're funded in many cases by the federal government to try those things out, it allows people in the federal government to observe and try to find out, well, does this policy seem to be improving outcomes? Does this policy seem to be improving outcomes? And so this kind of experimental federalism can be very useful, can be very helpful for the federal government to just kind of see what happens when people try stuff. Now, that is not to say that experimentation is something that should be pursued everywhere. And in many cases, the federal government will say, no, we still do hold that there's a compelling reason for us to have things like national level highway signage standards, so that no matter what state you travel into, if you drive on a highway with a speed limit over 65 miles an hour, the signage is designed in a way to be safe, right? There's certain things that the federal government doesn't allow states to experiment with. But in many cases, this federalism is sort of, a cooperative, experimental kind of process in today's day and age. So that's just a very brief overview of some of the types of federalism that we can perform in today's government. But really, I think the key takeaway to remember after this kind of lesson and this study of federalism is that we can't forget about the power of states. States are extremely influential today in policy, even though the federal government has, of course, grown substantially over the 20th century in its ability to get the states sort of on board with various initiatives and policies.